There's always going to be this sort of harking back to our childhood. We remember travelling on those buses with grandma, granddad, going to places, watching them going by in the streets. And it's quite funny because we take them for granted. It's only when they're no longer there we suddenly realise things have changed.
If you go to any heritage bus event nowadays, you'll notice that the younger generation of enthusiasts are usually happy to skip the classic half cabs for a modern low-floor bus. Yes, that old 6-plate Volvo B7 RLE is now a preserved heritage bus. Feel old yet? Of course, it would not come as a surprise that people are attracted to whatever they had grown up with. However, the growing trend of disinterest among younger enthusiasts raises uncertainty about the future of the nostalgic icons that started it all. After all, if the next generation is unwilling to look after these vehicles, what is going to happen to them when their owners are no longer with us? In a YouTube poll, I asked my primarily younger audience to choose between two buses to preserve, a 1949 Crossley or 1990 Volvo. 619 people responded, with a staggering 89% of the votes going to the Volvo. They chose the Olympian because they could relate to it. It was expected, but also quite a shame, because classic buses like the Crossley have spent decades in preservation, far longer than they have been in service. Thousands of hours of love and care have been poured into these vehicles by their owners, and I would hate to see it all go to waste, not to mention the loss of heritage.
Because as the owners have died, the vehicle has been left in a building ends up being cleared, and buses go for scrap. And of course there's also the idea of let's convert a classic bus into a mobile bar, mobile shop, and as a result those vehicles lose all their fixtures and fittings, which if anybody ever wants to put it back as it was, will be almost impossible to do. If you actually look on things like eBay, you will see some of the older buses that were preserved going up for sale for converting into a bar or have been turned into an open top. And we're talking about some vehicles that date from the 1930s that this is happening to, which means once they're gone, they're gone. And therefore you start to end up with holes in the sort of preservation scene of what vehicles looked like years ago. People like to go back to their childhood, and of course as time goes on there'll be less and less people that remember buses such as them, but there will be people who remember things like the Stagecoach Trident.
Trident's my favorite because I grew up in Hong Kong where you can see many British style buses. When I was a child, I always see Den's Trident and I always ride it, and it reminds me of my childhood.
This was something I used to go to school on. It's nice to see it being restored here in the museum, and it definitely brings back loads of memories.
In a situation where no one knows how to keep old buses running, could this be the future? A static display serving delicious food?
Modern buses are more difficult to maintain because of course you have things like complicated electronics, there are lots of safety systems, there are lots of things that go wrong, and of course on the most up-to-date buses you actually have computers that are controlling what goes on. When you think about some of the more modern hybrid buses, their batteries are already getting to the end of their lives, and as a result of that, if somebody wants to preserve one, are they prepared to pay the £50,000–60,000 for a new replacement battery if it's available?
I don't know whether I can see some of the modern vehicles ever being restored. Some people have taken more modern vehicles in now because that's what they're used to seeing on the roads. If they break down now, it will be very difficult to restore because you've got to plug them into computers, things like that, to actually find out what's wrong with it. You just can't restore them and preserve them like you used to do.
We find that looking after our older fleet is far easier. They're a very simple, very basic design, as opposed to the newer vehicles which have various electronic switches for gear changes and so on the semi or fully automatic drivetrains. This vehicle here is an AEC Reliance. It was one of the best coach chassis and bus chassis around. We could fabricate parts if we needed to get them, if it was something we didn't have in stock. They were just a very simple design, basic metals were used in the construction of the vehicles, as opposed to some of the more complicated parts on the more modern vehicles made of specialist materials.
Basically, I grew up with a B7. When we were going for scrap, I had to preserve one. I couldn't let one go, especially one of the Bolton ones, because I grew up on them. I've been on this bus I don't know how many times in service. A lot of spotters don't remember the older stuff. They don't remember the half cabs and the route masters and stuff going round in service, but they remember these. These are the buses that I grew up with, the same as people 20 years older than me grew up with the Atlanteans and things like that. People younger than me will have grown up with the NMCs, for example, and things like that. People come up to us at shows and say to us, you know, why would you want to buy that? Why would you buy that and not like a National or something? But why would I want to plough thousands and thousands of pounds into a National that I have no connection with? I've been on this and T-Mac hundreds of times in service. The other two not as much so, but you know, they're still what we grew up with, so that's why we preserve this era of things.
I think electronics is the biggest thing for modern buses. The concept's very simple, but it gets very complicated and in-depth when you're trying to find a fault, especially intermittent faults and stuff like that. With the older ones, you've got no processors or anything. It is pure physics and short circuits the most you're going to get. Another thing with modern vehicles is the heavy use of plastics. Obviously they can degrade, crack, stuff in the engine bay. I'm thinking here to Enviro 400s, we call them spider pipes. They're plastic runoff pipes for the fuel. Those become very brittle due to the heating and cooling repeatedly over many years, and they become brittle and they'll crack and they'll leak and such.
The problem with a lot of modern buses is definitely the electrical side of things. A lot of electrical problems will write a lot of preserved buses off in the future. I think it'll become to the point where they're just, people have had enough of them. The gearbox that was playing up with it, that was electrical. We've really had to talk ourselves out of scrapping it because it has been a lot of trouble. But with it being one of 4 left, we've carried on, we've ploughed on, and for now it's working. There is a lot of electrics on a bus, and you don't realise it until you buy one and you just have to start working on it. You pull down the fuse board in the roof of this and it is like spaghetti junction. You have no idea what anything is, and you manage to find wiring diagrams and stuff from Volvo, but the amount of bodge jobs whoever else has owned the buses has done to the wiring and stuff, there is things that have been bypassed past the master switch, like the CCTV and things like that, stuff that was never original to Wrightbus, just constantly draining the batteries. I think the B7s and this sort of age of buses will be the last of the more mechanical sort of buses. I think people will genuinely really struggle and will have to have a lot bigger of a budget to buy much newer than this, because there is so much electrical on anything newer than this, and it'll just get to the point where it's virtually impossible to preserve anything. Obviously nothing's impossible if you have enough money, but for the likes of a small group like us, it will become financially unviable to preserve anything because it's not doable. We don't make money from it, it's not a business. We do this as a hobby and for people's enjoyment.
As dull as they are to me, electric buses are still a part of history, and a rather significant one at that, representing the first mainstream change of propellant in nearly a century. To see if people shared my views, I created yet another poll on YouTube where I asked people if they would preserve an electric bus. This time I was in for a surprise. Of 733 votes, 82% said that they would preserve an electric bus. But if a modern diesel bus was already so electronically complicated, what about fully electric ones?
The problem that I can see with electric vehicles is the batteries. That battery only has a certain lifespan. It's not like an engine where if you service it regularly and you change your filters and all that, it will go forever in theory. But batteries aren't like that. They will just deplete over time. If your battery's on 70-80% of what it originally should be, you're not going to be able to get to shows on the other side of the country with it or anything. And Batteries are very expensive. The hybrids at Manchester, the E400Hs, for a new set of batteries I think was about 80 grand. No preservationist is ever going to be able to afford 80 grand unless you're a multi-millionaire to spend on a set of batteries for a bus. I can't see it happening. It'll be possibly specialist organisations and stuff that keep them going.
There's only, to my knowledge, 2 electric buses preserved in the UK. Modern EVs like the BYDs that we've just got here in Manchester, I think it's going to be pretty much impossible for any amateur to preserve one properly. The batteries in them are so expensive and very dangerous to work with if you don't know what you're doing. Even someone like me who's in the trade, I'm not allowed to touch them, or I'm not allowed to touch the high voltage circuits by law because they're that dangerous. Now, if you're going to try and preserve one as like a driveway mechanic or something, as a lot of buses are, you've got no chance, and they're that complicated with power regulation systems and that, and all the computer control involved, that it's just not realistic without having the tools or the knowledge and the money to keep one in operating condition. However, I do think that there will be static exhibits, as there is in London, as there is in here with the Lucas electric bus.
The technical challenge for us would be the Lucas 7 doesn't have batteries, we don't have a charging system for it, and the technology from the 1970s is entirely a one-off. It would be very difficult to get it running, and I don't think it's a practical consideration. But we are at least in a position to exhibit it. It was very much an experimental vehicle, and back in 1975 it was very unusual because it was completely electric powered. We're not in a position to operate it. It's very, very important if we can, because it brings the subject to life. Because if we can run the bus, operate it and carry passengers, we can demonstrate what amounts to living history and show what things used to be like in days gone by.
I think it's more important to fill the gaps than to have everything in working order. If you have a lineup of buses, say from the 1900s to the 2050s in the future, and if you have that gap where there's no BYDs, there's nothing, then it's just empty space, it's a bit of history lost. And I think it's much better to have a static bus as part of that lineup to show the progression than to have none at all. I think it's just as good to have something cosmetically restored as it is to have it mechanically.
If it's not drivable, then I think we can probably just collect a model which is much smaller, but it would be more interesting to see the bus still being drivable.
It certainly would be nice to be able to experience the same thrill of riding a bus in service years or even decades later. As time ticks by, we need to ask ourselves, what legacy are we leaving behind for the generations to come?